So yesterday, which happens to be recorded, listen to it, we looked at a letter from the rabbis of Prague. And it was interesting, by the way, because we know that in Prague, so while the Chassam Sofer doesn't mention the Prague organ or other things, the rabbis of Prague do, and they make obviously a distinction. But it's interesting. You can hear the class from yesterday. The rabbis of Prague, tweak it in a slightly different way because they have something to, they have a history of having an organ in an Orthodox shul. And generally, we've been talking about how this seems so different than the Orthodox rabbis writing against reform later in the 19th century, that this is sort of very halachic. And it mirrors the this book is a direct response to Noga HaTzedek, which is the early reformers arguing for their reformations, but those reformations are also argued in a very halachic way. And so it's really still being battled in a certain sense on halachic grounds. This is Rabbi Mordechai Bennett. Rabbi Mordechai Bennett's Rabbi of Nikolsburg. And if you'll remember, Mordechai Bennett obviously is very much a traditionalist, for lack of a better term. But one of his main students was Rabbi Horowitz, who had become who years later, this is 1819, who in I think the 1860s becomes or maybe it's earlier, maybe it's 40s or 50s, becomes the Av Bezdin, the posek of Frankfurt, and sides with Rabbi Ber Bamberger against Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch to stay in the community with the reformers, not for religious purposes, but for communal purposes. So this is his teacher, Rabbi Bennett. And he had said yesterday this question. He starts talking about the question of Chukotayim and the Maharik, who had said that if something has a purpose, it's not or it's not a lack of modesty, that it doesn't fall into the category of uvachukotem, walking in their ways. Then he quotes this Gemara in Sanhedrin, and he writes, maybe I'll start from paragraph before. He's writing back to the rabbis of Hamburg Bezdin. And it says, he says, first of all, let me address that which they had written in Noga HaTzedek, and he mentions two rabbis he mentions Noga HaTzedek. That book is very clearly a response to Noga HaTzedek, which was again the reform responsa, or the quasi-reform responsa. And he says that which they say that it's not walking in the way of the non-Jew, because it says in the Marik that the only isser of walking in the way of the non-Jew is if it's a breach of modesty, or if it's something that doesn't make sense. That would only be to imitate the non-Jew, but if it makes sense, like having music, then it's not. He quotes our Gemara in Sanhedrin. You see in our Gemara that the Gemara is worried about, at least there's one opinion, that uvachukotehem is an issue. The opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Kevin dichtiv sreifa v'oraisa, then the Gemara answers no, because it says it in the Torah about burning the clothing of the king, that's not considered uvachukotehem, walking in their ways. And he says, Tosafos says, Tema, Damash Mahacha Afagav, the Chukahi came to Sibarite Shari. So Tosafos there asks, let's see if we can find that Tosafos. one. Okay, so two. Should be those ones. Interesting. Tosa says here, Hatam Amar Lav Chukahi L'Shem Avodat Kochavim. He makes a distinction here between whether something is a chok because it's walking in the ways of an idolater. If it was an idolatrous practice, I feel like even if it was written in the Torah, it wouldn't help. We still couldn't do it. He says, but here, by burning the king's clothes or the sword, it's not neither burning the king's clothes nor cutting off the head while the person is standing. It's true, it's what the non-Jewish sovereignty does, but it's not an idolatrous worship. So he's still making a distinction. He's saying that when it comes to that it's written in the Torah is a good answer only if it's something that you're doing and it imitates the non-Jew. But if it's something that you're doing and it actually imitates a specific idolatrous practice of the non-Jew, then even if it's written in the Torah, that would not be permitted. It's sort of funny because a lot of the elements in the Mishkan, right, the Rambam says they were idolatrous practices. That's the whole point. Okay. So he writes, quotes that Tosas, even though it's a chok, it's the way of the non-Jew, since it's written in the Torah, it's okay. And it says in Masech Avodah Zarah, Masek lo chukahi. It seems like over there that it's not a way of the non-Jew. And Tosa's answers, it's exactly what I just mentioned, this distinction between idolatrous practice and just something the non-Jew does. You have a chukah la'akum, if it was actually an idolatrous practice, even if it was written in the Torah, that wouldn't help. I read b'chok akum. Here we're talking about something they do, shalol l'shem, but it's not idolatrous practice. Even the if that was the case, written in the Torah wouldn't help. Mufurash afila b'chok she'enam chok la'akum ba'adarabba ika be taimarabba b'hach sarfan al malachim maska shas sham mishum chashivusahu. So Rabbi Bennett writes here, he says it should even be a bigger problem because the reason you burn the king's clothes is because he's so important. There's a reason to be lenient and to that it's less degrading. So he says, nevertheless, you need it written in the Torah in order to do it. It's very interesting. In other words, he's saying if it was written in the Torah and this was an idolatrous practice, that would not help. He'd still be forbidden to do. He says, but if it's written in the Torah, you see from the Gemara that if it's written in the Torah and it's not an idolatrous practice, the practice the idolaters do, that's permitted. But he says it has to be written in the Torah. In other words, if it's a practice that idolaters do, specifically they do, let's say like playing an organ in their church, in order to permit it, you see from the Gemara, it has to be written in the Torah. You can't just permit it just because, he seems to be arguing, by the way, blatantly with the Marik, because the Marik had said, if it's not a breach of tzniut and it has a reason, it's not just something that they do that should be permitted. But he seems to be saying no, that you could prove from that Gemara that it has to be written in the Torah in order to permit you to do it, if it's something specifically associated with a style of the non-Jew, a way that the non-Jew does things. It says Miu B'Tosas, nevertheless, in Tosas over there on Avodah Zarah, B'Sifu Davar Sheyesh Bo Shnei Minei Chok. Chok Shel Hevel. So he says there's another element that Tosas brings in Avodah Zarah, which is the concept of Chok Shel Hevel. That you could have an idolatrous a custom of non-Jews, but there's also such a thing as a custom of non-Jews that's meaningless. Let's say that it's not shel hevel, it's not a practice that has no reason, or that's just to imitate the non-Jew. This is a little bit more like the Marik. If it has a purpose, that might be permitted, even if it's not written in the Torah. Parnatos says in Avodah Zarah. Rak gamle divrehem tzarich lomar hach desarfen al hamalchus afal pishiyesh b'tayim rabba. Burning the clothes of the king actually has a great purpose because it's honor of the king. But nevertheless, it's called hevel. It's called not a practice that has much meaning. Rabbi Huda rak mishum d'chsiv b'kra. Okay, that's sort of back and forth. B'vadai hach derofe. So then he goes back to another question that we've looked at before. What about the old question of a doctor wearing a special coat called a kappa? You remember that was what the Marit had been talking about. Ein tam onigla yoter mitam dechashivas gabe sreifa omitam micha minavelas gabe sayif. He says that's very similar to the case of the sword in the case of burning the clothes of the king, because it has a reason. So he says, so why is it that the Marik would permit the jacket, but we might not? But he wants to conclude from that you might not permit the burning of the king's clothes. He says there's a difference between the jacket of the doctor and the burning of the king's clothes. What is that? The Chola Uma Kula Osinkain, because the whole nation wears these special clothes for the doctor. This idea of burning the king's clothes is something that's it's a law forever. It's just accepted forever. And they're very very careful about it. But he says this idea of wearing the kappa coat that the doctors wear, some kind of long coat, it wasn't a national thing that they enacted. It wasn't a law of the non-Jews. It's just a custom that individuals started. It's not a law of the sovereignty. It's not something that you have to do. It could change any day. It's just that individual doctors started doing it for practical purpose of cleanliness or something. And it could change. Actually, I was talking to a doctor and asked them if they have to wear the coat. I was a medical student. And I said, is it like a law that you have to wear the coat? Or is it like considered like medical practice and, I don't know, to keep dirt off or something that and he's like, no, it's just custom. That's what he said. It's nothing. It's really has no purpose at all, he said. Wearing your regular clothes is no different than probably when it started, who knows, 100 years ago, they probably thought that your clothes carry germs and these coats won't carry germs. But it turns out not to be an issue at all. And so Rabbi Bennett is right over here. He's making a distinction between the sayif, the way of killing a person, and the burning of the clothes of the king on the one hand, and this doctor thing on the other. The doctor thing would be permitted according to Marik, but that doesn't mean that you can adapt that to the burning of the king's clothes. Burning of the king's clothes is a national chok. It's a national sort of law, or this is like a little thing people do. Not everything a non-Jew does forbid it. Okay, so that's an interesting idea. All right, we'll stop there for now. Okay. Yeah, so we'll do probably this letter, and then I found a few other books about this, about sort of the back and forth between the Reform and the Orthodox in that era. Some books written by Orthodox rabbis, against the Reform, who would be interesting to look at, see if they use any different reasons. Because so far, reasons used in the early 1800s are very different than the reasons used in the mid to the late 1800s. Okay.
Thank you. Good day.
Okay, thank you.